To the North Central U.S. Climate and Drought Outlook for June. Our speaker today is going to be Stuart Foster. He's the state climatologist for Kentucky, and you all have the pleasure of hearing him for perhaps the last time before he rides off into the Kentucky sunset. So this is a rare moment, and so we're all going to say thanks many times over to Stuart for his great service for climate services, not only in the state of Kentucky, but for the whole north central part of the country, and just being a good guy. So I want to say that before we get going here. My name is Doug Cluck, and I have from NOAA, I'm the Regional Climate Services Director based in Kansas City, and we have Dennis Toddy on also from the USDA Climate Hub based in Ames, Iowa. And we will take questions at the end. We'll take questions at the end, and after Stuart's done, and sort of help him sum up some of the issues that we're facing here across the region. So, Stuart, I see your presentation all big and bright here, so why don't you take it away? Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Doug. I appreciate that and appreciate the kind words there. We're starting out here looking at a green pasture and some hay that's been baled, and that maybe already is, but is likely to become a valuable commodity going forward here this year. Some general information about the webinar series. Want to emphasize that this reflects a collaboration among a number of agencies at the federal and state level, and that's a tremendous amount of work to pull all of this information together in a very timely fashion. Our next webinar will be on July 15th, Thursday at 1 p.m. Pete Goulet of the Minnesota State Climatology Office will be the presenter next month. And you can access information about regional drought updates and a schedule of upcoming events at drought.gov. And that, you know, they've recently upgraded their website, so there's quite a bit of information, new information, well organized there. And you can go to the regional climate centers, the Midwestern Regional Climate Center and the High Plains Regional Climate Center websites for an archive of webinars, both in terms of the slide presentation and actually being able to listen to the presentation there. And as Doug mentioned, there will be time here at the end for questions. Today we're going to summarize current conditions and what's been happening recently, take a look at some impacts that we're observing, and speculate a little bit about what may be happening if current trends continue, and then we'll wrap up with the outlooks before we have time for questions. Laura Edwards sent me this photograph from the Lee Park Municipal Golf Course there in Aberdeen. I don't know how many golfers we have out there on the webinar today, but dry conditions have led to a water hazard that's not so much of a hazard, but exposed a whole lot of golf balls that have accumulated there over the years. So a rather unusual shot that you don't see every day. Now, getting into the current conditions, we're going to look at some rankings. We're going to focus, I think a key theme here today is that we have a lot of data that's traditionally summarized on a monthly time scale or seasonal time scale, but what we'll see is that a lot of what we've been experiencing doesn't fall neatly along the calendar in terms of months and such, so we're going to have to break things down to really understand what's been going on at different time scales. But here we start out with the May precipitation ranks for this at the state level, and again, this is averaging conditions all across the state. You can see that for the month of May, it's fairly benign. We have some dry conditions below average and much below average in Michigan, whereas we have much above average precipitation in Colorado and also above average there in Kansas, and most states then being near average for the month of May. But again, that that hides a lot of things that have been going on. The March through May period shows a more distinct pattern and a very interesting one when focusing on the north central region. The upper plains there in Michigan, again, have been below average to much below average precipitation-wise. But then you transition as you go down to Nebraska, Colorado, Missouri, and you jump over the near average categories from areas that have been clearly below average precipitation to areas that have been clearly above average precipitation. So a pretty sharp boundary there for the region. We look at temperature ranks for May. May was a relatively cool month over the region, with much below or below average conditions being prevalent more so in the southern states within the region. And as we get into the northern plains, with the exception of Montana, being in the near average category. But if we look at the longer period, going back to the 3 months from March, April, and May, and March, if you recall, was particularly warm. And so for that 3-month period, we have above average to much above average temperatures, with Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan falling within the top 10 warmest for that 3-month period. Accumulated precipitation, now we're getting a little bit more granularity. We have some interpolated maps for the last 30 days. On the left, we see the accumulated precipitation totals. And then to add some context, on the right-hand side, you see that precipitation expressed as a percentage of the mean precipitation for that area. And that's probably a more useful graphic in the sense that there's a pretty distinct precipitation gradient from east to west. So eastern areas traditionally having much more rainfall. And you can see that in general in terms of the accumulated amounts on the left. And then the one thing to really focus on here on the left side, you can see in North Dakota, far eastern Montana, and the western half of South Dakota, there are areas that are shaded in the blue, indicating that they received 3 to 4 inches of rainfall over that 30-day period, which was much needed, much appreciated rainfall. In some cases, in general, it fell in fairly short time periods over that 30 days. But that reflects an anomaly compared to what had been experienced in that region. But if you look at the percent of mean, you can see, again, the predominant pattern across the region are the yellows and browns, which range from 25 to 75% of normal. So most of the region was below normal. Portions of Wyoming and extending to Montana, Colorado, and then portions of Minnesota were extremely dry over that period. If we go out over a 90-day period, and again, on the right, where we look at percent of mean precipitation, again, the yellows, browns, such are the predominant pattern there, indicating below normal or below average precipitation. The exception of that is in eastern half of Colorado and much of Kansas, there where conditions were wetter. And I would emphasize there, as you're looking at Colorado, the distinction between eastern Colorado, where it's been quite wet over that 30-day period, and western Colorado, where it's been the opposite, quite dry. Temperature-wise, just looking at the past 30 days, on the left, we're looking at the average maximum temperature in departure from the mean. And on the right, we're looking at the average minimum daily temperatures in departure from the mean. You can see on the left side that temperatures have run well above normal, particularly in the northern half. If you look at the southern tier of states within the region there, including Kentucky, Missouri, and Kansas, those temperatures have been pretty close to normal, but you can see some pinks there starting to shade toward red, which indicate high temperatures averaging somewhere around 9 to 10 degrees above normal over the last month. That's pretty significant. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the same pattern for low temperatures. They're not as pronounced in terms of being above normal, but they are clearly running above normal across the region. Now, here's part of the real significant story. Again, we need to break it down at a sub-monthly level. And here we're looking at the June heat wave, and somewhat arbitrary. I picked the beginning and end of this, but June 3rd to June 10th there. So that's an 8-day period. And you can see that high temperatures across a region from Minnesota, across the Dakotas into Montana and Wyoming, running about 20 degrees above average. That is extreme heat, an extreme anomaly. And the low temperatures, again, running well above average, with a little bit of an eastward shift there in the areas that are being impacted. So I think on the left-hand side, the extreme dryness in the region has helped to elevate those high temperatures, to reach as much as 20 degrees above normal or above average for that region. This is a pretty significant event in terms of extreme heat. And just to kind of highlight that, if we look across the Midwest and the Great Plains, on the left-hand side, we have a map from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center that is covered up with stations that set records. In many cases, records for both the highest high temperature and the highest low temperature for the date, somewhere in a 2-week period from June 1st to June 15th. So that is particularly prevalent up through Wisconsin, Minnesota, and such. But you see cases of records being set throughout the Midwestern region. And on the right-hand side for the Great Plains, we don't have a map, but maybe a nice compliment here is that we have a list of some places there in the Dakotas, Minnesota, Montana, that have recorded extreme temperatures that were so high that they haven't been seen in quite a while. Again, many cases of temperatures above 100 degrees there. Now you can imagine what those kinds of temperatures, how that weather system impacts soil moisture. On the left-hand side here, we see calculated soil moisture rankings on June 15th, so taken just a couple days ago. And there are lots of reds there indicating that soil moisture are in the lowest percentiles on the scale there. That is, it's extremely dry conditions there. We're certainly aware of that in the West, kind of outside our region of interest here. But the areas, again, across the upper plains and Midwest, and then extending over to Michigan, which has been, again, particularly dry. We noted that on the precipitation maps. Soil moisture very short in those locations. And on the right-hand side, you see the impact of that recent heat wave from the first half of June, just how much drying has occurred, particularly in the Midwestern areas. So you can see a little bit of improvement of conditions up there in the northern part of North Dakota and Montana there along the Canadian border as a result of the rainfall that they received in the first part of June. This set of maps shows the Evaporative Demand Drought Index, or EDDI, as it's referred to, and won't get into the details of this, but very simply, this is an indicator, a measure of how thirsty the atmosphere is, how much it is trying to extract water from the environment. And of course, it can only extract water if the water is available. And in what we're seeing when we look at the soil moisture there is that there's very little water available. But this is an indicator when we see these reds here of a potential for very rapid drought intensification. And that's a theme that we need to pay attention to here. Stream flows. So moving into hydrologic conditions here, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the 7-day stream flows. On the right-hand side, we're looking at a longer-term period averaged out now over 28 days. You can see that the patterns are generally pretty similar here, and you get the big picture just by looking at the color shading across the map. But let me highlight just a few things here. One, if you look at Colorado there, we mentioned the distinction between eastern and western Colorado, and it shows up here. So you can see a lot of green above average stream flows in the eastern half of the state. In the upper plains there, focusing on North Dakota, Minnesota, you can see stream flows running below normal, with a little bit of exceptions there in western North Dakota, where as a result of some of those recent rains, some of the streams have shown some flashiness, and stream flow levels have increased, but it's not widespread, certainly in that area. And without a return to more frequent precipitation, we would anticipate those stream flows will again recede to lower levels. Stream flows also, if you focus on the area of Michigan, again, it's been dry, persistently dry for some time now, and low stream flows are prevalent throughout that region. Whereas if you move to the southern part of the central region, again from Kentucky across through Missouri and Kansas, generally stream flows are running around normal, or in some cases above normal there. So very much a different story depending on what part of the region you might be located in, but a lot of area that is suffering quite a bit from the dry weather that we've had. Now, taking a look at the Great Lakes. As you are probably aware, over the last few years, the Great Lakes have been running at or near record levels, but water levels in the Great Lakes have been generally decreasing. Again, drier conditions have been setting in. And this set of graphs, you're looking at the upper left, Lake Superior, lower left, Lake Michigan and Huron, and then on the right hand, moving farther east, Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. On those graphs, you got a legend there, but basically the dashed blue line shows the average lake levels, and you can see that has a seasonal component where it tends to peak in the summer months. The red line shows the actuals, and that red line is still generally trending above the average, with the exception of Lake Ontario, where water levels have reached a lower than average level. And there are some projected cones there of water levels that suggest that the current patterns of decreasing levels, again with the seasonality built in, are expected to continue here through 2021. Now taking a look at the Drought Monitor, it tries to pull all of this information that we've been looking at together into one place. On the left-hand side, you see the current Drought Monitor that was just released today. And on the right-hand side, you see the 1 year ago picture. So I wanted to kind of highlight not just where we are today, but how far we've come, how much change there has been over the last year. And then we'll drill down even a little bit more on the next slide. So we'll start in the northern plains again. There's been, again, already a lot of concern about conditions in the Dakotas. Montana and such, and there we have exceptional drought, extreme and exceptional drought prevalent through that region, even though there have been some recent rainfalls. That's certainly not been sufficient to alleviate conditions significantly in those areas. Also, again, Colorado, and note, I've said it already, but just note the distinct gradient between the western part of the state and the eastern part of the state. You don't see that too often where the change is that abrupt. And then otherwise, drought conditions becoming pretty commonplace across the upper half of the region, extending across the Midwest through Michigan, with a small area of extreme drought now identified around the Chicago area in northeastern Illinois. Otherwise, across the southern half of the region, conditions again are pretty benign. And I can speak from the perspective of Kentucky. Every time that we've gotten to the point of we need to introduce D0, it might show up there for a week and then it rains and it goes away. So very different type of climatic conditions and patterns depending on what part of the region you're in. Now, looking on the right-hand side, you can see just how much things have changed from last year. But at the same time, you'll note that, that there was drought, some moderate drought condition and dryness in the Dakotas and certainly in Colorado and such. But the Dakotas is the focus area here and parts of Minnesota. So the drought conditions that have developed, in essence, didn't just come out of the blue, so to speak. This was something that has been developing there since last year. And likewise, there's been dryness in the in Minnesota and some other parts there, the Midwest, but it's really the Dakotas that has intensified from last year. Otherwise, the amount of drought coverage has increased, again, it's mainly in the West and upper parts of the plains and Midwest, but it's at the highest level across the country since 2013. And it's the first time we've seen D3 in Wisconsin since 2013. So you will remember the 2012 drought. That was a very extreme drought across the region. And so essentially what we're saying is that we're seeing the greatest coverage of drought since that period. Now on the right-hand side, we can look at the change that has taken place here in just the last 4 weeks. And you can see the intensification of drought in the areas that were impacted by the heat wave there in the northern part of the Midwestern region in particular, and see some improvement there that had occurred in the western part of the Dakotas and the effects of the rains in Colorado there. So it is worth noting that, again, this is a very dynamic situation given the conditions that we've experienced over the last couple weeks. So time will tell us what happens, but it will be very interesting to see what these maps look like in a month. Wanted to just highlight real quickly some historical perspective. And so I've got 3 sets of these graphs, one for North Dakota, one for Michigan, one for Iowa, 3 areas that are suffering from drought in different ways right now and at different stages. But here on North Dakota, on the left, you're looking at a time series going back to the late 1800s of the 24-month standardized precipitation index. And this basically tracks extended periods of wetness or dryness. And you can see the Dust Bowl era there in the 30s of very extreme dryness. But you'll notice that over the last few decades, North Dakota has generally been pretty wet with some periods of interrupted there and some dryness, but a generally wet period. On the right-hand side, you're looking at the 6-month standardized precipitation index. So this is showing on a shorter time scale, the development of, or the swings between very wet and very dry conditions. And you'll note on the extreme right there that we are currently in a 6-month period of extremely short precipitation that rivals anything on the record over more than 120 years. So that rivals anything going back to the Dust Bowl, what we've seen here currently. So it's a very significant event that's occurring right now in the Dakotas. For Michigan, notice that the 24-month SPI shows an unprecedented wet period, unprecedented both in the length of it and the intensity of just how wet it's been. And so on the right, you see the dryness that has developed with the bar reaching down over the last 6 months. It represents a tremendous shift from what Michigan has been experiencing really over the last couple decades. But if you look back historically, while it's very important, it doesn't rival other 6-month dry periods that have been observed back through the record. And then this last one, looking at Iowa, kind of somewhere in between. Iowa, again, has been generally quite wet over the last couple decades. And the dry conditions that are developing there now, we're concerned about dryness. As we'll see later, there's some issues with water availability. But yet the 6-month index here is very modestly showing dryness. So nothing historically significant, but again, we'll see how that develops. Okay. So moving on and talking about some impacts now. There are a lot of them across the region, and really can't give due credit to everything that has been going on and everything that needs to be documented. But we'll start out with wildfire. It was a major issue last year, as you will recall. And with persistent high pressure in the west and long-term drought that has developed across the region, that results in an elevated risk of wildfires across the region, both in the western mountains and across the plains. Very different types of land cover, going from forests to agricultural and grasslands, but fire risks in both areas. In the northern Great Plains, elevated as a result of farm operations, other human activity, dry lightning strikes. So there's a lot of ways that fires can get started when you have these types of conditions in terms of drought and heat. And one point worth noting, particularly in Colorado, where there were some very large fires last year that have left scars on the mountainous landscape, is that there is a real concern about the potential for increased runoff rates and leading to flash flooding in those areas. Have avoided problems generally so far, but it's certainly a risk going forward this summer. Now looking at water supplies, the mountain snowpack is nearly gone. And in the upper portions of the Missouri Basin, many of the reservoirs have kind of filled what they're going to be able to fill here this year. The concern is going forward. So runoff in the upper Missouri Basin for the month of May was only 64% of average. Unfortunately, the projections were pretty much on target, that flows were going to be low. And the projection going forward for the 2021 is that runoff will be about 69% of average. It is anticipated that there will be some measures put in place that will have some impact on navigation flow support. Those decisions will not be made until July 1st and will be based on what conditions are like in terms of reservoirs at that time. But the expectation is that we will see some gradual implementation of measures that could have some adverse impacts on navigation. But this would just be the first level of that. So the conditions, hopefully they don't deteriorate, but there will be many more levels that could be possible if conditions were to persist, into next year and following. Some other things across the region. Interestingly, as we're talking about extreme heat waves, just a couple weeks before that, or less, a week before that, we had a late season freeze that caused damage to crops. Corn here shown on the left, soybeans on the right. In North Dakota, that was the area that was impacted the most. But there were freezes impacting other portions of the region. We'll talk briefly about that here in another slide. We've seen, again, dry pastures, so the hot, dry conditions have really impacted pasture lands, but some areas where that did receive heavy rainfalls. You can see runoff there in a field in Montana there on the right. So it really just depended on where you were in terms of what you got, but in many cases, whatever it was extreme. Pastures and livestock then. So drought has led to poor pasture conditions, not surprisingly, in North Dakota and other impacted areas. Here's an announcement from North Dakota Water Commission and State Engineer providing drought disaster livestock water supply project assistance for farmers there. In general, hay was cut early in an effort to try to maximize the quality that could be obtained from it, but that was as a trade-off for yields. So the bottom line is there's not a lot of yield there in terms of hay, and the prospects for another cut later are pretty slim at this point. Farm water supplies are low, water quality issues have been raised, and many producers are calling their herds in response to the conditions. In terms of crops, the hot, dry weather has adversely impacted the development of corn in its early stages, and that's important to point out here. We're looking at early stages of corn development. Here's a picture in Iowa that shows some gray shaded corn as leaves have rolled and turned over, and that's pretty unusual for corn at this point, at this time of year. But again, it's pretty early, and if we were to see a return to more normal precipitation, which would mean about an inch a week, probably would overcome the poor start there for corn there. Notes from Nebraska that the good rains that occurred in May and such have helped quite a bit in terms of providing some deeper soil moisture. But again, as conditions have dried and weather has warmed, there is a need for precipitation here within the next maybe 7 to 10, 14 days, or they may start to see some impacts. The high temperatures have accelerated the grain fill stage in terms of winter wheat development. And while that sounds positive, it has a negative impact because it results that filling occurs too quickly. It tends to occur and compromise the yield that is possible from wheat. So mentioned the freeze there previously. The impact of that in Michigan as a result of not just the May freeze, but freezes in April, is that it will have an adverse impact on fruit harvest there, apples and such. So there will be a harvest, but not what they were hoping for. Once we get beyond agriculture, we start to think about hydrologic impacts in terms of water supplies. We talked about stream flows. Now, as we look at municipal water supplies, the city of Des Moines in Iowa has implemented its water shortage plan, and there are other areas that rely on surface water or shallow groundwater where there are some concerns and restrictions being put into place. So this, again, will be something to pay close attention to going forward. As we noted before, conditions could change pretty rapidly as we get in here to what is traditionally the heat of the summer. Now looking at some crop conditions, kind of quickly run through some different crops. Won't spend too much time, but you can already kind of picture what these maps should look like based on what we've talked about up to this point. Pasture and range conditions on the left, you can see the areas that are either in the good or excellent category, and on the right, the percentage of area that is in the poor to very poor category. So they should complement one another, and you can see the general pattern that the very poor to very poor conditions are widespread in the Dakotas and Montana, but otherwise good conditions across much of the region, especially as we move south and eastward within the region. Spring wheat conditions, the impact of the weather in the Dakotas has certainly had an adverse impact on the condition of spring wheat crops. As we look at winter wheat, we've had a cool spring in some areas, but has delayed development a little bit, but we have a good percentage there, 70-some to 80-some% of the crop that is in good to excellent condition in the eastern portion of the region, and then areas that are a little worse off, again, as we move into South Dakota there and Montana. Corn condition, again, we're still pretty early in the growing season. Corn looking better across the southern portion of the region, more prevalence of poorer conditions as you move farther north. And again, unfortunately, the Dakota's kind of under the bullseye in a lot of this right now. Soybeans, again, still pretty early for soybeans, and they're a pretty resilient crop. Can rebound pretty well if precipitation comes later. Conditions of soybeans follow generally a similar pattern to what we've seen with other crops. Now, moving on to outlooks, the 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast is calling for some abundant precipitation, say average to abundant, across the eastern half of the region. If you look in the area there, Wisconsin, parts of Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and across parts of Michigan, if those areas receive that inch or inch and a half or so of precipitation, it would be greatly needed and make a very positive impact in that region. So fingers are crossed that that will materialize. And then otherwise, as you move across the western half of the region, you can see that precipitation amounts are expected to be pretty light. They're less than a quarter of an inch in most places. So really not what is needed at this point. The 8 to 14-day outlook is calling for a shift from the above normal, from the well above normal temperatures to below normal temperatures being favored across the eastern half of the region, the Midwest, and likelihood of favoring higher than normal temperatures in the western half, including the Dakotas there, Montana, and such. And then on precipitation, expected to be wetter than average, or an increased likelihood of that across much of the region, with the exception there of North Dakota and parts of Minnesota, and then drier conditions expected across most of Colorado, parts of western Kansas, and parts of Wyoming. The monthly outlook for July, and again, I want to emphasize that these outlooks now reflect the new climate normals. So the likelihood of being above or below normal is probably a little bit reduced from what we were working with the old climate normals. But the month of July, across the northern half, or northern portions, there's an elevated probability of above normal temperatures. And again, that's not surprising given how dry conditions are across that region, and drought and heat tend to go together. And then on the right-hand side, most of the region in the equal chances category of precipitation, with some elevated probabilities of wetter than normal down in Kentucky, parts of Ohio, Indiana, such, and drier conditions being favored across Montana, parts of the Dakotas, and Wyoming. Looking out a little bit farther on a seasonal scale, that pattern is generally persisting. Likelihood of warmer than normal temperatures across the much of the region, with the exception of an area that comes up there through the central part of the country, extending through Missouri and neighboring states. And then again, the wetter conditions continuing to be favored to the south and eastern portions of the region, and drier conditions likely to persist farther west into the northwest. As we look even farther out to the fall, October through December, we see a little bit of shift in the pattern where dryness is now favored to the south and warmer conditions favored to the south. But again, that's a pretty far into the future look at this point, and those outlooks certainly subject to change. Will depend in part as to what type of INSO circulation develops, whether we come back with La Nina circulation or not. The wildland fire potential shows areas there in the northern plains above normal and areas in the west above normal for July and into August, but no real risk beyond normal levels through the Midwest. Seasonal drought outlook. The negative thing here, there are two things. One is that there's a large area that's covered in terms of drought. And the other thing is that most of that is shaded in category that says drought likely to persist or drought likely to develop. So again, situation has been changing quite a bit, is prone to change more. Unfortunately, it's not likely to move in the direction we would like to see it. So with that, we'll summarize in just a few bullets. I really can't capture everything in just a few bullets here, but drought conditions in the upper Great Plains have built from dry conditions in 2020. Extreme heat in the upper Midwest Great Plains has contributed to rapid development and intensification of drought in portions of the Midwest. So that's the area that we're starting to pay closer attention to, see how that plays out going forward. Impacts initially limited to agriculture are expanding to include municipal water supplies and will likely impact navigation if conditions persist. The outlook for cooler temperatures in the second half of June is expected to bring some temporary relief following the early June heat wave. There's pretty high confidence in that outlook for the remainder of June. Again, be much appreciated, especially if it's accompanied by some precipitation over the next week or so, as the 7-day QPF is suggesting. Otherwise, the seasonal outlook indicates that drought is likely to persist with no indication of a reversal to that pattern of dry weather in the upper Great Plains and Midwest. So not the rosiest picture to paint at this time, but with that, Doug, I will send it back to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Stuart. And we got quite a bit to go through here. So before Dennis and I and Stuart churn through, we don't have that many questions, but I want to go back to those outlooks and just do a couple caveats on them. Could you go back to the QPF, for example, which stands for Quantitative Precipitation Forecast? Really, that is an accumulation of how much rain it could fall the next 7 days. This is summertime. We are in summertime, so widespread massive rains, sort of unlike what's going to happen in the Gulf of Mexico, are pretty uncommon or less common this time of year than they are, let's say, in the cooler times of the year where we have widespread precipitation. Certainly in the spring, we can get big sort of long precipitation events. These tend to be shorter in length and more localized. So when you see a map like this, sure, it looks very hopeful in terms of getting rain in a lot of places. So my caveat here is it is summertime and we tend to see more localized heavy precipitation events than widespread ones. Unless my other caveat is unless you're on the Gulf Coast, but we're not down there, so I'm not going to talk about that. So next slide, please. Go to the next slide. Yeah, that one. So on all these maps for predictions, I just, and I've said this before, but I want to caveat just a little bit more, is that where those lighter shades are not strong forecasts for wetness or dryness. The darker the shading gets, the higher the confidence. I think you understand that, but just wanted to reiterate that. So where you're seeing those light blues, light greens, light tans, that's a pretty low confidence forecast in terms of what's going to happen. Again, this time of year from now until the end of August, things are tough in terms of predicting, especially precipitation above or below normal. It gets really hard. Go ahead, Dennis. Yeah, I know you want to say something.
I'll caveat Doug's caveat, But the positive aspect, at least on the temperature side, is that we're leaning towards cool, we're leaning away from being hot. So that's a positive. Yeah, I agree with Doug. Leaning towards wet is good, but it's still really tough this time of year.
Yeah, it's not the answer that we want, but it is like we're all saying, leaning in the direction we'd like it to be. That's not true in the western portion, mostly the Missouri Basin sort of portion, where things continue to be look like they're going to continue to be not only warmer than normal, but mostly drier than normal. Yeah, and then same thing here. I would say those precipitation outlooks are not strong, so I wouldn't put a lot of credence in them. I know there's a lot of what we call EC in the middle, which means an equal chance of above, below, and near normal. Doesn't mean it's going to be normal. It just means there's an equal chance of could be below, could be above, could be close to what we normally get. So also shows sort of a lack of confidence and typical for July, to be quite honest. Next slide for the seasonal outlook. Same thing. There are indications of near normal and maybe even below normal, kind of in the southern plains up through Missouri, for temperature, and then a similar pattern for precipitation as we saw in July, really in the southeast being above and northwest being below. Dennis, or Stuart, do you have anything you want to say? The other thing I wanted to say real quickly is that if he goes to the next one, you may be beginning to recognize maybe some artifacts of, or a better word would be implications of where we're leaning in terms of this fall and winter with the return of La Niña, if that happens, or La Niña-like temperatures and precipitation. But again, it's a little early to get into that. I think in July and definitely in August, we'll have a better handle on how far or how strong that La Niña concept is going to be and impacts. Okay. Sorry, Stuart. And Dennis, do you have anything else on that note?
Nothing right now.
No.
Okay. Let me go to some of the questions here. Yeah. So, what are the concerns? And Dennis, why don't you start on this? What are the concerns about drought and damage to corn and soybeans and really crops? We'll just say crops across the Midwest, and take into account the temporal angle on what we're up against and what we need.
Sure.
Go.
Stuart, you go back to the corn condition ones. Let's go there. We're dealing with a couple different issues. Corn is the immediate problem because we're getting, within a few weeks of that tasseling, that reproductive period where the most damage can be done to corn. We're already stressing corn over a good portion of, that driest area. You see where the corn condition has taken a real dive over Minnesota, Iowa, parts of Illinois, Wisconsin, the driest area. We're stressing already, so if we reduce yield a little bit already, that's why it's critical we get precipitation soon, and the cooler temperatures will help us because that can reduce some of the stress, but we need more rainfall coming. But we're also dealing with a northwest, southeast part of the Corn Belt. Southeast part of the Corn Belt is still in pretty good shape. As long as precipitation keeps coming there, they may do okay. It's that northwest half of the Corn Belt that we're most concerned about right now. Soybeans have some time, they're stressed also, but if we get into August and get some precipitation, soybeans can still do a little bit better. And then grasses and some of the other crops, the small grains and winter wheat have seen some damage up in the Northwest already.
And Dennis, do you want to say anything about moisture levels in 2020 versus 2021, deep soil moisture?
Sure. We had not as dry conditions starting last year, but dry conditions starting last year. But we had soil moisture deeper in the profile that we were able to tap into across the Corn Belt. The incredibly dry start that we've had so far this year is, we don't have much in that deeper profile. There are parts like southeast Iowa and Missouri where the profile is in decent shape, but that northern Iowa, northern Illinois, Wisconsin, there's not much deeper in that profile. So now as we're starting to dry out that surface even more, the crop doesn't have much to work with lower. Then there was also, and this kind of goes along with that soil moisture question that was asked, was why the difference in soil moisture models, and we could go on for half an hour about this. We won't. There are differences in soil moisture models, the data, the methodology, how long a period of time. You look at them like you look at computer models, and you say, well, what is the similarity to? Are they saying the similar things? If there's widely differing ones, then you try to figure out why it's widely different. The specific question was about Minnesota. I think the one model just wasn't catching up with what was happening in southeast Minnesota. The other soil moisture models really are catching what's going on.
Okay. Yeah, and so now I think when you showed some of your temperature maps in terms of compared to normal, Stuart, you were that one. Nope. Yeah, go back one. I'd go back. Yeah, lately. What we don't have in here is from the 10th through today, really. Obviously, we can't have the highs today or tomorrow because it hasn't happened. But if we did, you would see that blob sort of shifting a little bit further south, blob being extreme heat. And that is extreme heat, by the way, and numerous records for the month. And some of those temperatures haven't been seen, 100-degree temperatures haven't been seen for a number of years, period. And if, of course, there are records, they've never been seen. But let's see, what is the other thing? Oh, yeah, for that many days in a row of, we certainly have set records and broken them by a lot. Not individual days, but for strings of days being above a particular temperature. Numerous records have been broken, sort of never seen before this early, especially this early in the year. This is July weather definitely July and early August weather that we're sort of seeing in early June for that matter. Anything you want to say about that, Stuart or Dennis?
Yeah,
and yes, this does contribute to that dry soils and all those other things. There's a question here real quick. It does contribute to the fact that it gets hotter. It can get hotter once you dry out that top, layer, and the plants and everything else kind of shut down. It just contributes. It contributes to the heat, to be honest.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about that theme, the predominance of sensible heating versus latent heating. When you deplete soil moisture. And that becomes a particularly noticeable issue as you move east because it's normally there's a good bit of moisture in the environment. And so when there's not, you can see a big change. So just as an example of that, a couple years ago, in 2019, we had a flash drought in September here in Kentucky where the average precipitation statewide for the whole month was 0.2 of an inch. When it should have been, 3 or 3.5 inches, something like that. And it turned, we had over 20 days with temperatures above 90, and September, in terms of high temperatures, was the hottest month of the year. And that was very much connected to the dry conditions across the state. So it can make a big impact.
And Dennis, more on the corn and soybeans things. Corn can still recover quite a bit. Soybeans can recover the better, right?
Correct. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, but the problem just a little bit more. We've stressed corn, and the longer you stress the corn, the more damage you're going to do to it. And seeing numerous reports of corn being stressed, and you can tell because their leaves roll and look like a pineapple for all of the day by 8 or 9 in the morning in some cases. Also hearing places where showing how extreme it is that either sandier soil areas in a field or fields where you have some compaction, corn close to being too stressed and dying off in those areas, small areas of fields where there's more problems. So, we're teetering on some problems. We can still get rain. My concern is the longer term, not only the chance of rain in the next week to 10 days, but can we keep getting rain after that? Because that's the other thing to remember. Corn and not soybeans yet, but corn is close to a point of using like 1.5 inches or 2 inches of water in a week if it's available. So even 1 inch of rain in a week right now doesn't get you even through a full week. So we need not only the next week, but we need ongoing after that.
And then comparisons to 2012, we had a question about that and rapid drought intensification, which, of course, a lot of the conditions have been in place to do that. Unfortunately, in the northern plains, we've been dry through last fall, really through last summer and fall, and winter was sort of in between. But then this spring, we didn't get a lot of the rains that we had. So there's one thing I don't know if we've, how much we stress this, but we've been watching and waiting to see if we would get enough rains. And now some places like Kansas, Missouri, southern tier states in this area, eastern Colorado have actually come out of it pretty well, but north of there, not. So 2012, anybody? It's a little different, but there are some similarities.
Yeah, I would comment that I think one thing to really keep an eye on is 2012, especially as the drought intensified in June and into July, we had that high pressure dome that had developed across kind of the Midwest, and then part of it was centered over Kentucky where we are, and then it started shifting westward across the plains and such. That's when the drought really intensified there. But this time we have a little different setup because we have that situation in terms of the high pressure dominant over the southwestern U.S. And so it's a kind of different setup. If we were to, I would anticipate that if somehow that would kind of shift this direction, then things could really deteriorate quickly. But I don't know that there's any indication that would happen.
Right. Okay, and let's see, here's another one. How does long-term drought typically affect the plains in the wintertime? Could well below normal soil moisture allow for faster movement of cold air from Canada due to lower specific heat? Probably not as much in the cool season as the warm season. There's just so much more. The difference in about the amount of moisture in the air is almost exponential between, let's say, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, and 90 degrees, or how much it can hold, certainly. So we do not like going into the fall or seeing a dry fall for a lot of reasons. That's a recharge season. We call that a recharge season for deeper soil moisture through portions of the winter until things freeze up. So that's why we were worried last summer, fall, really fall, winter, that we weren't seeing that recharge that we were hoping for in a lot of places. That's more important. The recharge is more important than soil moisture and cold air moving north or south. Yeah, I'd say that. Any other comments on that? One other thing is another kind of point someone was making, thank you, Kevin, is that very low dew points, and dew points is the amount of moisture in the air, can lead to higher maximum temperatures during the day. It's something Stuart referred to in terms of sensible heat, and these are sort of technical terms, but the greater the sensible heat, the less moisture in the air, basically. And so that's why a desert heats up to 100 degrees during the day and 40 degrees at night. There's just no moisture to hold that heat in the air, if that makes any sense. Same thing has happened here. We have not seen long stretches of high moisture content this spring. Even now, I mean, yes, it's humid in Kansas City today, don't get me wrong, but we haven't seen that expansive Gulf moisture, let's just say, make its way north and stay up there like we've seen in the past. It's just drier air. Any comments from you all? I know we've commented on this a few times this spring. Canadian air, I guess you'd say, or
Stuart,
whatever.
you want to chime in?
No,
Right, I guess.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, yeah, and it allows us to warm up more quickly in the daytime, allows us to cool more quickly at nighttime. We haven't had extended periods of moisture like Doug talked about, and because crops are stressed, they're trying to conserve and use as little moisture as possible because they realize that their moisture is limited. So we're not transpiring moisture out of a crop as rapidly as we would have. Typically, by this time of year, corn would be pumping out a lot of moisture and adding moisture to the air. It's really not doing as much of that right now because the stress is limiting the amount of moisture that it's transpiring.
Yep, and we don't have any more questions, so I'm gonna cut it off. But I'm gonna say that Dennis and I are considering having a more or less a drought. Another one of these drought webinars sort of around July 1st if conditions continue to degrade. If we don't see that if we don't see the number one, the cool air, and we don't see any precipitation with it, there's going to be trouble. So we think we need to ramp up our activities in terms of serving you all. And if you want to be on the email list for that, I guess, and if you're not already on mine, you can write to me at doug.cluck@noaa.gov, and I'll put you on the list to get that. That's probably the easiest way for me to do that. Otherwise it's kind of hard to get to you all. I can do it, but we haven't decided to pull the trigger on that yet. We're going to see what happens with this cooler air in early next week in terms of moisture. Anything to add to that, Dennis?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. We appreciate your attendance. And until, I guess, June or July 15th, we'll have our state climate office from Minnesota on giving us a briefing. So thank you very much, everyone, and talk to you next month or before.